Hi, my name is Scott, and I coach Lincoln Douglas debate, and I am one of two people that is going to be giving this sort of quote unquote progressive, quote unquote circuit style topic lecture on the 2021 November December LD topic. So, some things to start with. The first thing is I want to break down sort of what you're going to see, so that if you want to go to a specific part that you can just do that. So the first thing is that at the bottom on YouTube, there's going to be a bunch of different like sections that you can click through that should have a heading. I highly suggest that if you only want to watch a specific part or want to know more about a specific thing, that you utilize that. I specifically recommend that you go and watch Nay's critique part at the end. I think is absolutely phenomenal. The other thing that I would recommend is I suggest starting with the traditional LD topic lecture that Joseph Barquin did for this channel that I released a couple days ago, because there's lots of different portions of that that apply to what I'm going to talk about, but I'm just not going to talk about it because there's going to be like definitions and different background info that I just don't feel are necessary or aren't appropriate for kind of how I'm viewing this portion of the topic analysis. The last thing that I want to say is this isn't meant to be comprehensive at all. This is just kind of like a bunch of preliminary thoughts that I have pulled together. There's no way that somebody could become an expert in something in 1 week, and is more meant to stimulate your thoughts about what the topic is for what you want to say. So I'm going to go down, I'm going to break down kind of like the background, the history, some different components to the topic, as well as sort of the topic from like a LARP side of the policy debate scale. And then at the end, Nay is going to take over and do sort of like a critical perspective, some critical takes on the topic. So let's get to this. So the topic is resolved. A just government ought to recognize an unconditional right of workers to strike. I highly recommend you like stop the YouTube video right now and go click through to Joseph Barquin's video, because he did a video where he like broke down every word of this, what it meant, all of those different things. So if that's something that's really, really important to you, I highly recommend that you start there rather than here, because I'm going to go into like kind of like the origins of this, the history, some different tidbits that might help you compose what you want to say on the affirmative and the negative, but I'm not necessarily going to get into like, this is a worker and students aren't workers, so students don't have the right to strike underneath this topic because they're not workers. That's not really what that's not really the purpose of what I'm getting at here. So let's jump into kind of like the history and the background information. So the right to strike sort of comes from the National Labor Relations Act of 1935. This was a piece of legislation passed during the FDR administration. Obviously, FDR pretty pro-labor, pro-worker, because he and his administration are trying to solve and resolve the Great Depression. And as a sort of pro-labor president, he thought that collective bargaining was a fundamental human right. So this was something that his administration did. Very importantly, Section 7 of the NLRA says that this really only applies to private workers, and it also excludes workers in some critical industries like the transportation industry, which I'm going to get to later. But Section 7 of the Act specifically says, quote, it grants the workers the right to engage in other concerted activities for the purpose of collective bargaining or other mutual aid or protection. So this is very specific to strikes, but also only applies to private workers, not public workers. And there's actually no federal law that grants public sector workers the right to strike, but there are a dozen state laws that grant certain public sector workers the right to strike. 38 states don't. But that could be something that a lot of different teams could look at for this topic. I'm not even talking from like a federalism perspective, but I think there's all sorts of different municipality state arguments that different teams could read. The second historical thing that's really important is the Taft-Hartley Act of 1974, which is an amendment to the NLRA. Basically, what the Taft-Hartley Act did is it added a bunch of prohibited actions or like unfair labor practices that labor workers and unions sort of like had a beef with. And in order to do that, the act also prohibited a bunch of different strikes, like jurisdictional strikes, wildcat strikes, solidarity strikes, political strikes, secondary boycotts, mass picketing, closed shops, all different sorts of things. Some of these that we're going to talk about later, but just know that this was kind of like a very important update, and that if you're interested in this, you should definitely look into the specific nature of this. On a specific note, I'm going to talk about jurisdictional strikes on the next slide. So if you're particularly interested in that, you can stay tuned. One of the things that I found interesting over this is that during the Truman administration is when the Taft-Hartley Act happened, and it was actually vetoed by Truman, and then Congress overrid Truman, which is an incredibly hard task to do. So that's maybe there's some politics arguments coming down the pipeline on this one. The sort of like third really historical point that a lot of the literature that I read on this sort of led to was we just passed the 40th anniversary of Reagan firing the entirety of the nation's air traffic controllers. So on August 3rd of 1981, 13,000 air traffic controllers went on strike, and like literally planes couldn't fly. And Reagan said, "Y'all need to go back to work or I'm going to fire you." And they said, "No, you won't." And on August 5th, Reagan fired 11,358 of the 13,000 air traffic controllers. The other ones had like gone back to work already. So that is sort of an important reference point to a lot of different actual arguments that I think that people can make on this topic that are sort of based in history. So the next sort of angle to this is sort of like, what is a strike and what types of strikes are there? So first is that there's two major types of strikes. The first type of strike is called an economic strike. Basically, this is when a worker will strike in order to bargain for like better pay or benefits. So like, for instance, few workers in the US have access to like paid sick time or paid leave or things like that. So that might be something that would classify as an economic strike, or like maybe advocating for health and safety protections or something like that. But generally, economic strikes, most people are going to classify as want some type of wage-related increase, some type of economic thing. The second type of strike, and these are strikes that are like protected under the National Labor Relations Act. The second type of strike would be an unfair labor practices strike, and that would be when the employer violates labor law, so kind of like illegally retaliating, like firing employees for unionizing, or firing people for refusing to bargain with the union, or firing or like discriminating against different union members or things like that would be unfair labor practices strike. They would also be like, the conditions for your employment. One of the things that could be an interesting take on this topic is that for most union members, there's a general like clause that you don't strike during your contract. So there's a lot of industries that like right at the very end of their contract. As soon as the contract ends, the entire union will go on strike. A lot of people who are familiar with like NBA, NFL, there's some historical examples of this happening. I read an article that said that GM manufacturing workers are notorious for doing this. That sort of like the minute that their contract expires at midnight, that they will go on strike, and that going on strike beforehand is not something that that is really uh, seen as being good. But the more important thing is something that's known as a wildcat strike, and that is essentially when employees go on strike without the union's approval. And so that could be a different type of strike that maybe affirmatives say that that's something that people should have the unconditional right to. Recognition strikes could also be a part of the topic, which would be a strike that could be forced, which could be a strike that forces an employer to recognize a union. The other type of strike, which I talked about with the Taft Hartley Act, was jurisdictional strikes. And jurisdictional strikes are refusals to work in order to affirm the rights to like a particular job, or to protest sort of like the assignment of work to ununionized people, sort of like how work is delegated. So I think that these types of strikes could be important because I think people might affirm different types of these. You might see disad links based off certain things. I don't know. Something that I think is very important is, how do replacements work? Because when people strike, a business can't operate. What do they do? I think that this is pretty similar to how like the generic drugs or the counterfeiting argument will work on the current intellectual property topic, where I'm not sure this is like a disad, but I think this is like a major sort of like solvency thing that most affirmatives are going to have a nuanced answer to, or figure out how this works. So basically, we talked about there are two types of strikes. Under economic strikes, employers are allowed to hire replacement workers that are permanent. Now, this was a really hard distinction for me to get at first into literature, but essentially, the business that you're striking from is allowed to hire a permanent replacement for you, and you are not entitled to have your job back. You are only entitled to kind of like a first dibs at your job. So you're not fired, you're just first in line for your job. So under unfair labor practices, permanent replacements are not allowed to be hired, is my understanding. Under economic strikes, you are allowed to be replaced, and that replacement has the right to the striker's job, even if the striker agrees to the thing that they have been striking against. However, a lot of unions, as a condition, or businesses, really don't want to hire replacement employees because hiring replacements is an obvious sticking point with a lot of unions, and it's a general stipulation for most people when they strike, in order to like cross a strike line, that they get their job back. So normally that's kind of like a condition for how it works. The other thing to note is that for like skilled industries that are striking, like, you know, GM manufacturer, car employees, like that's a skilled job. It's probably pretty hard to find a whole new workforce of people that have incredibly skilled jobs, especially if we're talking about certain AFs that I think people will read on this topic. Something that is an interesting note, though, is that strikers can be punished. So there was an example in one of the articles that I was reading, that the business, because the workers were striking, took away the workers' kids' healthcare benefits, and that was something that was allowed to happen, and that actually led to the kid joining the picket line for striking with the adults. So, you know, there's a lot of interesting, nuanced arguments here that I think could go a bunch of different directions. So, sort of like the last part of the background. Unconditional strikes. What is an unconditional strike? And I think that this is really important because I think that there are certain types of strikes that are currently disallowed by law, that if were allowed would be really interesting, sort of like this type of strike affirmative. I think one of those, or a couple of these examples would be like sit-in strikes. So like you are currently not allowed to sit in at your place of employment while striking. You are also not allowed to do a slow down strike. So like let's say I am a car manufacturer employee. I can't purposely work at a very slow rate to produce less cars as a way to strike. That is not something that is allowed under federal law. Also, not allowed are intermittent strikes. So, this would be like, striking every week or striking every month or striking a bunch of different times during a period. Some another kind of interesting angle to this is sick outs. Are sick outs a form of strike or not? I mean, effectually or functionally, I think that they probably are, but I think that that is an interesting angle for the topic. I think that a really interesting angle is secondary strikes. So secondary strikes would be something that's not protected under law right now, which would be like the ability for you to protest your company's doing business with something. So like let's say like you work for Amazon and you don't like how the company is treating the earth and you don't like their global warming stances and things like that. You aren't allowed to protest. That's a secondary strike, because that's not something that is related to your economic status with the company or your sort of like fair labor practices. So that's what's known as a secondary strike. Now, there's sort of some different ways that I saw to get around this, but I think that those could be some really important distinctions that people could make on the topic that are sort of worth talking about. Now, what I want to do is I kind of want to jump into sort of like the argument section of the sort of topic lecture or analysis. I'm going to start by going through sort of like a bunch of AFs and a bunch of like policy disad counterplan type arguments. And then I'm going to hand it over to Nay, and Nay is going to take sort of the critical arguments that he thinks are going to be good on this topic. So, the AFs. What about AFs on this topic? The first thing is I think this is just about the biggest this is the biggest topic I've probably ever seen. I think there's legitimately thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of affirmatives on this topic, especially with the different permutations of different things that I am going to talk about. So I think that, this might not be a good tea topic because there's just legit thousands of different AFs on the topic. I think that, workers might be somewhere you could get some exclusive definitions from. Maybe it's not like students or volunteers or something like that. Maybe there's like some military things going on there. But this is a huge topic. Why is it a huge topic? The first reason it's a huge topic is I think a just government means that there are a lot of different countries that you could read on the topic if you're not going to look at it from like a whole res type perspective. So like legit the last 18 minutes of this talk have been me talking about how the US treats treats workers' right to strike. There's so many different affirmatives that aren't about the United States on this topic that I think that there's going to be a ton of different single country affirmatives that different people are going to read. I think some of these AFs are really, really, really good and nuanced. I think some of them are like really not that good. So I think that, we will probably see someone read the China should let workers strike, and then that overturns the government and the CCP collapses and US unilateral hedge is good. I don't think that AF is good. I do think a bunch of people will read it because that's kind of, for some unknown reason, popular. That's not really what I'm talking about. I think what I'm more talking about would be like an affirmative that either does a single country or does a specific industry within that country. So, for instance, I definitely think that there's a solvency advocate out there for a New South Wales crane workers strike affirmative. And I think that that's a pretty good sort of example of the direction of why I think that there are thousands of AFs on this topic. I think that sort of the specific industry slash profession side of it, there's just tons of different people that you could give the right to strike. Teachers is going to be a super popular affirmative on this topic. Crane workers, I mentioned, I saw manufacturers is definitely a thing. Prison guards, police, firefighters, port employees, municipal employees, healthcare workers, doctors, nurses, sort of any critical profession that you can think of. I think that there's going to be an affirmative about that. And I think that that sort of like permuted with the number of countries that you can have, just there's so many different AFs on this topic. I think that there might also be affirmatives on this topic that will talk about the circumstances upon which people are employed, kind of like a lot of the stuff that I talked about before. I think that there's definitely a like nationwide general strike AF that could be really good on this topic. I think there's some interesting, like the military could right to strike AFs. Like there's no way that troops have the right to strike. How does that affect their readiness, morale, all sorts of different things like that? Obviously there would have to be like some conditions on that I'll get into talking about later. But I think that, you know, there's maybe some potentiality there. I didn't do any work and researching that, but I just know debate people for some reason love making these military arguments, and that will be something that people will try to say. Along those same lines, there's definitely a cap AF, like a capitalism bad AF on this topic, but I'm gonna wait and let Nay talk about that when we get to the critical part of this topic lecture. The next part that I want to talk about is sort of like the contentions and advantage areas. I think that there are a bunch of different places that different people could go here. I think that there's not necessarily like the COVID contention, but I think that there's a lot of COVID related arguments or things that you can think in a COVID related mindset that are going to be good advantages on this topic, that are going to be like people striking because they're no longer viewed as essential. So like grocery store employees were once essential and are no longer essential, things like that. And that has caused people to like lose pay increases, lose certain benefits that they have, all sorts of things like that. Along the same lines, in the unfair labor conditions striking part of the topic, I think that there's like a, you know, COVID makes the conditions of our employment unsafe. We need PPE. We need all sorts of different thing type affirmatives that they could be really good. I also think just like the straight up economy advantage that just says they get more wages, they get more spending power, workers' rights, labor args, things like that, could be really good. I think there's going to be a bunch of industry specific contentions. So I think like the teachers education AF is a really good example of this, where you're going to say like civic education good, or kids need to learn about global warming, or something like that. And you know, these could get even like state politics disads. So like for instance, West Virginia, Kentucky, and Oklahoma, it's all illegal for public school teachers in those states to strike. I think people could read like things that are specific about those regions or parts of the world, or their interactions with their local and state governments, and all sorts of different things like that. I think there's a ton of different examples here with kind of like manufacturers and all sorts of things like that are outside of just like the economy argument of like it'll be a more fair, robust economy where people have higher wages. I also think that there's going to be sort of a healthcare contention where people are going to say that it's unfair that people don't have healthcare and they should have the ability to strike over that. And there's going to be like some health costs, internal links or something like that people are going to say. I think that there's great ground for racism slash feminism slash inequality type contentions on this topic, where not just like strikes are key to help unions combat inequality in the workplace and things like that, but I just think that there's a really good sort of like core topic ground of lit on these on these issues. I also think that there's some really good literature on civil liberties and civil rights and sort of how it is a fundamental human right to collective bargaining. I think that those advantages could be pretty popular. I think that we haven't talked about this yet, but I should have probably put this in the AF section. I think this is a giant courts topic. I just like I really think that lots of people are going to say court related things on this topic. I think you could see a lot of Supreme Court AFs. A lot of people do very specific things within the law, which I also think means that we could see a lot of international law type court AFs where they rule on specific things, maybe the ICCPR, something in the EU, some human rights related things, all of which have previously affirmed the workers' right to strike. So I think that courts huge ground on this topic, and I could literally do an hour lecture on the courts in this topic. Really good. Tea, not really good. I don't think this is a tea topic at all. If you're into tea, I highly recommend that you watch Joseph's traditional video, not because it like has anything groundbreaking. It's great, but it goes through all of the different words and what you might want to do to interpret those words. So I would start there if you think that you are going to read tea on this topic. I don't think this is a good tea topic at all. I think part of that is just there's so many AFs, it's going to be really hard to prove why, a couple more wouldn't be a bad idea, unless it's just like super blatant, like they're like, student right to strike and not workers' right to strike. Obviously people are going to read the whole res tea argument because people are going to read specific AFs, but I'm not going to give my input on that. Next, the second to last part of my portion of this topic talk is disadvantages. I think there are an incredible number of good disadvantages on this topic from a logical standpoint. I'm not sure if I found a bunch of cards that for this stuff yet, but I think that the essential professions / workers DA is amazing on this topic. I think that there are an incredible number of industries that probably shouldn't be allowed to have the right to strike because it would lead to civil institutions collapsing and chaos ensuing. So some examples of this might be firefighters, police, correctional workers, hospital employees, public utility employees, people who remove snow, sanitation employees, school employees, hospital guards, things along that standpoint. I think there's all really interesting arguments that you could have maybe specific DAs about these specific industries. Sort of the two examples that I've been giving for this is the Secret Service probably shouldn't have the right to strike. That would probably lead to really bad things happening. And I also think that it would be probably really bad for society if all nuclear power plant operators struck. So just some things to think about. Maybe giving all workers the right to strike would just logically lead to some bad things happening. Also logically, not really, but how they work, I think that the politics disad is really good on this topic because Republicans sort of just hate workers' rights, and I think that that's going to be a really solid link argument for lots of people. They're just going to be like, hey, your AF is super pro-labor workers' rights. Republicans hate that. There's probably going to be an amazing debt ceiling disad late November, early December of this topic. I think politics disad could be really, really, really good on this topic. I think the economy disad could also be really good. I think you could go for arguments like strikes hurt productivity or they lead to job loss or scabs or replacements or they hurt business confidence. I think there's a bunch of different angles that you could take here. I also think that all of their courts DAs are going to be really good. I'm not going to get into that, but if you're a courts person, think, courts of this topic is really, really, really good. Replacements I already talked about, but I think that if it's not a disad or if it is a disad, I think it could be really good. The word rights is in the topic. That sort of set off my alarm bells that someone's going to say rights Malthus. Please don't say rights Malthus, but somebody is going to say it. I didn't have federalism in here at first, but I really think the federalism disad could be good because a lot of stuff that I'm seeing seems to say that states do things that federal government doesn't. So sort of like these 12 states that do protect public workers' right to strike. So I think that would be pretty good. The last thing that I want to note on the disad section is I think the link uniqueness is really good for disads on this topic, because I think that the right to strike has pretty much eroded from American society if you're going to take this from like a US centric perspective. And I think that means that your link uniqueness for disads is really, really, really good on this topic. So the last portion that I'm going to get into before I hand it off to Nate to talk about the critical perspectives is kind of like the different counterplans I think people could read on this topic. I think conditional strikes are going to be really, really, really good. I believe Joseph talked about this a little bit, but I think that this is going to be really interesting even from like a process counterplan perspective, because there's a bunch of different professions that don't allow unconditional striking. So for instance, nurses have to give 30 days notice in some states that they're going to strike. And if your hospital strikes, there cannot be another hospital striking within a certain like area. So I just think like certain different conditions of the strikes, even if it's not the nuanced like what is a conditional strike argument, it has the potential to be really, really, really good on this topic. I also think going in line with the essential workers / professions disad that I was talking about, I think that picking out of those workers and reading that disad against whole res AFs is probably going to be super popular on this topic, and something that I might look into if I was a counterplan debater. The third counterplan that I think people will look into is kind of like consult the unions or something, some process with the unions, something that's not a strike, something that the unions do. I'm not really sure what this looks like. I just think that there will be a bunch of counterplans that involve the unions. The word recognize in the topic set off some alarm bells for me. I couldn't find this before I put together this talk, but I distinctly remember there being a word pick out of the word recognize and it having some type of court net benefit, that like recognize was different than acknowledge, and that had some sort of like functional legal difference. I think that if that's a thing, that is sort of like core neg ground that you can read against almost every AF on this topic if they choose to include that word. So might be something that I look into. The last thing is, if people are going to read courts AFs, the court's neg ground against those things is going to be really good. But also, if they don't say courts on the AF, the court's counterplan is going to be really, really, really good. So I think that, from a policy LARPy kind of perspective, it's pretty hard to escape the courts on this topic if the other team chooses to deal with the courts. So I might think about what I would want to do in those style of debates. And I think that these debates could be really nuanced if you chose them to be, because you could have like 2021 cards that assume the current court and all sorts of things like that. I also think that people will read some of the most atrocious courts arguments with old stuff that assumes an old bounce in the Supreme Court and all sorts of stuff on this topic. But I think that that's definitely some core neg ground on the topic. And that's kind of where I'm done. I want to now hand it off to Nay, who's going to finish this topic lecture talking about the topic from a critical perspective.
Hello, I'll be doing the critical section of the general strike resolution for LD. If you don't know, or if it hasn't already been talked about, the resolution is that a just government ought to recognize a workers' strike. And so I think that there are a lot of really interesting ways that critical teams can really introduce, or can really have a really interesting engagement with this type of topic. And so I really want to use this type of critical lecture to kind of cover some ground and talk about like the ways that I think a lot of policy arguments will try to kind of like accommodate the way that various critical teams are kind of adjusting and making criticisms off of the resolution, and the ways that I think that various like types of literature bases really take up the question of like what we should do to get in the face of that. I think that there are a lot of really interesting arguments to be made about like how that force of kind of like workers collective, or the idea of this kind of like universal workers collective, is something that is kind of like debunked, or something that is criticized by like various different authors and different literature bases. And so I definitely want to talk through like different levels of indice that you can use to kind of like take up that kind of thing. I think that, for instance, when you're starting to just think about like base, like what are some of the core controversies or core critical places where I think that most teams will really situate their offense, I think there's really a plethora of what teams could do, but I definitely want to break this particular part of the lecture down into 4 critical areas of what we'll be talking about. The first will be like, how does this type of resolution interact with just like a straight up cap debate, and how I think people can kind of like make the cap K work or not make it work, or make it useful in this type of resolution as negative argument and affirmative argument. And then I kind of want to go into talking a little bit about Black studies, being like Afro-pessimism, Moten, and various other authors and their takes on the resolution, what I think are kind of some of the best arguments that can be made about like it as an organizing principle. And then I think the last couple things that I really want to talk about is settler colonialism and the way in which land dispossession and various types of genocidal dispossession create the conditions for us to kind of like rethink what a kind of like general workers strike would really look like. And then I kind of want to talk additionally at the end a little bit about like what a postmodernism kind of like look at the topic will be like, in order to kind of just dive into what I think might be like something a little bit out of left field that you can maybe consider as an angle for how you should be dealing with some of the arguments that are on this resolution. The first place that I really want to start is the cap debate. I think that it's a really interesting place to think about, considering that this like topic is really set up so that teams can read like anti-capitalist arguments on the affirmative. I assume that a lot of teams will probably read argument about why an unconditional right of workers to strike is like key to reconfiguring the way in which we relate to capital, the way that we've kind of like responded to industrialization, etc., and really use it as a way to have a conversation about like what the relationship between a state endorsed kind of like movement for communism or a worker strike really looks like. And I think that that's a really, really interesting debate to be had against the Cap K, particularly just because I think that the Cap K is something that's so good as an argument because of the way that it kind of like molds and bends per resolution, and the way that it's like still applicable because people don't really have like really specific agreements about like what that kind of like condition or response to capitalism is going to look like. And I definitely think that this place is no different. I think that there are so many good reasons, for instance, to kind of like situate a lot of your offense in this portion of the debate on why the kind of like organizing principles that would lead to an unconditional right of workers to strike under like governmentality would fundamentally like basically consume like what it would actually look like to create an actual communist movement, and why that kind of like symbolic move by the state only kind of allows for an assuagement of what like capitalism really does as a particular set of violence. I think that when you're going down the cap route, my suggestion and my thoughts on where we should kind of like start this type of like topic lecture is really thinking about like how can we kind of like go farther left as a response to what teams will do on this resolution. I feel like so many teams will have like a more leftist response to like how they're supposed to kind of like read affirmatives on this topic. And so I feel like when you're kind of reading a critique in general, the better response against criticism such as this is to go farther to the left and basically say that like a state-based kind of like endorsement of these things is a way in which they're able to produce particular pathologies of those that do not organize in relationship to the state, and that the state's recognition of such a worker strike would only be something in order to accommodate the already kind of like existing relationship between like various types of private enterprises and the public. I think that this would allow you to really have a really strong debate about like what types of organizational tactics are kind of like created under a general worker strike. And I feel like this is the place where I feel like a lot of teams you should kind of push to be more specific if you're a critical team trying to engage this topic, is what does that general worker strike look like, and what does it look like for those that kind of like don't follow that motion and tactic for like what a proper strike looks like. I feel like there are so many interesting ways in terms of like what it means for a state to recognize an unconditional right of workers to strike without actually giving them to right to do so with like particular types of tactics. So like, for instance, I feel like there's a huge debate to be set up on the cap debate about just the relationship to capitalism and whether or not we should have a violent or non-violent response, and what that kind of response does in terms of like changing the way in which we view a policy, like thinking of striking as a right. I feel like the kind of like indite of a human rights framework under this kind of consideration, paired with an argument about why things like anarchism, black anarchism, kind of offer us a different way to think about maybe a horizontal or a diagonal way of organizing that refuses kind of like the state's recognition in favor of trying to align ourselves with those that the state doesn't recognize, with those that are kind of like pushed to the side and are kind of thought of as those kind of like violent, pathologized protesters, etc., because of the way in which the kind of like right to strike, much like the right to free speech, doesn't necessarily like condition or create a necessary idea about like what types of things will and won't be restricted, and how that is created under various tactics of policing, that I think is a really good place to situate both a lot of your offense when trying to indict the rights framework and the kind of this idea of this kind of like worker strike is this like vertical kind kind of corrective thing to the state as a whole. I think that secondary to that, when you kind of like get into the Black studies portion of the topic, this is another place where I feel like there are so many good engagements, and I think that a lot of the times you'll definitely see people kind of, I think, taking up just the basic idea of like, should we kind of like think about the worker as an organizing principle? And I feel like obviously Black studies has a lot to really offer in terms of that discussion, in terms of explaining that the idea of this kind of like universal class of the worker to be given the right to strike, for instance, would only allow that, for instance, under certain paradigms that don't allow people to properly respond to gratuitous anti-violence that happens on a daily basis. It kind of like allows a kind of like palpable condition to move over the ways in which various types of other people are disproportioned by conditions that are both created and molded by capitalism, but that do not cut the same for those that are grafted differently via things like anti-blackness and otherwise by such types of systems. And so I think that when you're trying to think about like how the Black studies responds to this particular type of resolution, I think the first place to kind of sit down is to really go through the way in which we're thinking about like slavery as a condition for how we're able to get to industrialization, and how that kind of like undoes our ability to think about like how a human rights or a citizenship based framework could really do anything to resolve the ways in which we're kind of considering what an actual revolt against the state and organized in such a way could be. I think that beyond that, the other place that I think is really interesting for a lot of people in Black studies to engage before we really get to the mutant part of this portion is to really talk about the ways in which Afro-pessimists have really written about their own organizing experience, their own activist experience, and their tracing of history of various activist experience and the response that the state has had to that, right? Like, even if the state does not gives workers the right to unconditionally protest, that does not mean that the state, for instance, gives legitimacy to Asada, the Soledad Brothers, the Black Panther Party, the MOVE movement that they've already kind of gotten rid of. And I think that things like, for instance, talking about even going back to things like Incognito, where Wordleson is talking about his type of organizing in South Africa and the relationship the state played in terms of their recognition of the protests that were happening in South Africa, are all places where I think you can really situate a lot of like really strong material organizational offense to split yourself apart from a lot of what these other types of organizing principles around like what the worker is and what it looks like, beyond just the idea that like Marx may be wrong about this particular type of framing. And I think taking that into the way in which you consider these real historical examples and how we kind of have to lie in the wake of kind of witnessing them, and how they don't fall under like what we would consider the workers' right to strike because of the type of tactics that they took up, what that would look like in terms of rethinking like what the affirmative could do in terms of actually giving recognition to those that are trying to do resistance, and its ability to kickstart resistance, given that it requires the ability for us to limit out other forms of expression or other ways of being able to organize, which the state often does in forms of various types of recognition, which I think is really historically sound and a good argument to kind of go down. I think that when you're kind of thinking about like what Moten kind of looks like in relationship to that type of thing, I really think that where Fred Moten is really interesting in terms of Black studies, and where I think a lot of other arguments about Black studies can really take people, is really asking the question of like what the workers' strike to looks like at a social level, and how that kind of like forces a particular organizing principle that turns this kind of like beautiful resistance from under the ground into something that is kind of like formally recognized by the state. Moten has a lot of good arguments about the difference between like planning and planners. He makes a lot of arguments about policy and planning as well, where he talks about the idea of like policy's ability to subsume radical protests in order to it was subsume radical protests in order to like basically force those that are kind of radically planning on the outside of what is accepted to conform and move into the system, that those people are basically doing something that is way beyond what the state's even limited or has the capacity to do. And so it forces them to kind of like compromise both socially and materially in terms of what their organizing principles look like. And I feel like that is really a place where you can kind of like force teams to really defend the workers' strike portion of the topic, which I think is a place where I feel like historically I don't know as many teams are going to be really geared up to go, because I feel like a lot of their arguments will generally about like what types of movements are arising now and what types of demands can be made, but I don't really think that answers the question of like what those types of social apparatuses do in terms of how various types of vertically organized movements and various types of worker strikes have specifically done things in order to put the concerns of Black workers, to put the concern of those that are within their community but are otherwise from their condition of being worker, whether it be because of their relationship to the prison or their just position in relationship to anti-Blackness greatness as a whole, that there's this kind of thing that happens that creates an inability to really organize on the same type of principles because of the way it excludes the kind of like radical capacity of being fugitive, refusing to be recognized by the state, and the advantages that come to such a thing in terms of thinking about what ways we can organize community beyond what the state kind of like compels us to do and to mimic it, which I think is a really important set of arguments to make about like the difference between just the structure of the resolution and what it attempts to accomplish as a whole. And then I think that it makes it a lot easier when you're kind of thinking about this in relationship to things like settler colonialism. I feel like this is a place where we kind of return to that original critique of Marx that we were talking about when we first brought up Black Studies, which is really just a question of how do we really think about like how the worker comes about and like what that history really does to reveal how types of organizing principles cannot always be taken to the future in terms of their ability to be adaptable to the conditions that various types of people are facing during oppression. I feel like there are so many good arguments about how things like industrialization, the kickstart of capitalism, etc., cannot be done without the ability to seize land and remove natives and create and continue the process of active genocide. And I think really starting there in terms of like how you situate your arguments makes an argument about like how settler colonialism already kind of reconfigures and kind of frames how we think about like the worker coming to being in the first place, and why things like, for instance, the relationship between various types of like reservation politics and their relationship to capitalism, and the idea of those types of positions being excluded from the condition of being worker, that it really changes the terms of like what an actual general strike looks like. Oftentimes, for instance, there are so many communities where their economies are kind of like not I guess sort of self-sufficient in the way that they're kind of like working for each other, and so the worker strike, for instance, will only be a way for them to deprive their own communities and doesn't actually allow for a way to like actually hold settlers and like those that are basically privileging from settler colonialism as accountable for the ways in which those things are accumulated. And I feel like there are so many good settler colonialism arguments about why that kind of move to recognize the worker strike is a form of guilt assuagement that is meant as a process of continuing to forget genocide and kind of push it to the purview, which I think is a really good place to kind of like situate a lot of your offense about what that kind of policy does in terms of the process of forwarding what would not just look like de-radicalizing other movements, but in the entire process of trying to move towards erasing a history that is necessary to understand like how the worker comes into existence and why capitalism exists in such a way that workers feel the need to protest in the first place. And I feel like asking that question and then drawing it to the European tradition of Marxism can really ask critical questions in terms of not just being like we should refuse the European tradition, although I do think that's an interesting line to walk. I also think pairing that with the kind of arguments about how the particularity of a worker strike does something in order to continue the process of assuagement and guilt protection, that it does something in order to undo the work that people are doing in other places. And I feel like that is a really good place to kind of like walk down in terms of how you're able to situate what that kind of like critical problem with like the resolution or the way that the topic is kind of framed as a whole. And then when I think you're kind of like kind of moving and pivoting to something a little bit different, which is like what does the postmodern kind of like link to the topic look like, I think this is the place where things get a little bit more creative in terms of like what you can do, because I feel like in a lot of these places there are so many good arguments to be made about why like state recognition of the ways in which alterity and otherness focus is an attempt to make various types of bodies conform, whether it be symbolically or whether it be at the level of like expenditure. And I think that there are so many good arguments to be made, specifically in the context of Bataille and Baudrillard, about how things, for instance, in terms of the way in which the worker strike and the recognition of it contributes to the way in which the general and restricted economy kind of like work in relationship to each other, and proves kind of like the thesis about why this form of consumption is necessary for getting rid of alterity and gives uniqueness for a lot of the arguments that you would make with Bataille. While on the other side, I feel like when you're looking at things like Baudrillard, you're really making arguments about why things like hyperconformity and the ability for us to kind of like see the system as attempting to basically adjust itself in order to be more inclusive, in the same way that people have been talking about like Baudrillard in relationship to the academy, where this kind of like radical leftist approach to the way in which we think about like study and the practice that we use to get to things like the resolution ultimately require us to basically fold ourselves into norms that make us complicit with these institutions, which can be seen from the state, i.e. like the conditional and the ability to recognize workers is the ability to basically fold them into those that become policymakers, to make them part of the system, and to continue to forward hyper reality is the only condition for which we can live, which I think also sets up the basis for making some creative arguments between the relationship between a lot of like postmodern theory and the way that it relates to a lot of the questions that we're asking about like racial identity and the way in which various types of like radical movements relate to the kind of like process of capital accumulation, and why the kind of like state-based understanding of a recognition of a worker strike doesn't get to the point of how we're able to kind of like understand what the crux of the resolution is, and how worker strikes continue to kind kind of like forward a way for us to forget the various types of conditions that make capitalism possible, which I think is a really good place to start this debate, whether you're on the affirmative and on the negative, because it allows you to have a critical crux of the topic that requires a differential response than just using the government as something that is like recognizing the citizens' rights. And I think when you pair any of these like really marked specific critiques on the ideas of a worker strike and combine them with a critique of a human rights framework and what that recognition does to undo radical potentials and what it's done in other places, whether foreign or domestic, is a really good place to kind of like situate a lot of your history and examples that I think are really important to have a well-rounded argument as a whole. Hopefully this video will help you, and hopefully you'll continue to watch the videos that we'll be doing talking about general strike, and yeah, enjoy the rest of the lecture or the end of the lecture. Thanks.